You count it?
Yep.
How much?
$765,118 even.
Working with Don Siegel was a joy.
I thought I'd never live to see that much money. Never mind have it for my own.
1/3.
Huh?
1/3 is yours, 2/3 is mine.
Sure, good buddy. Sure.
And in a way, it spoiled me because I thought all filmmaking was going to be like working with Don.
In working on Charley Varrick, I could being a visual person, I had a certain idea of what the film was going to look like. And knowing Don Siegel, there are very few Don Siegel movies I've seen through the years that I haven't really enjoyed because he's a storyteller. Unfortunately today it's not so much about the story, it's how much CGI can you pack into something. Don was more of an emotional, he did the original Invasion of the Body Snatchers. He was a storyteller, and for me to look back, I think any good filmmaker today will look back on the films of Don Siegel and say they hold up, and they could learn from these films.
Don Siegel was my inspiration. I always loved the movies he have done, and for me it was an incredible honor to be able to work with him.
Whether it's Charley Varrick, which is the title it was released under, or Kill Charley Varrick, which is one of the European titles, or Last of the Independents, which is what Don wanted to call it. The finished film has its moment, you get what's going on, and you're out. It's an economy that is very much a kind of Don Siegel economy, and it's the kind of thing that I think American movies used to know how to do. They were lean, spare, and didn't really give you anything that they didn't have to give you.
Don Siegel would walk onto the set and he would have the entire film in his head. He knew exactly almost every frame of the film.
I immediately fell in love with this film. I saw it at Universal in a screening that my father had arranged. And of course, it's a great film. So I was just blown away.
It's a very, very big cult movie. People just are crazy about people say, oh, I've seen that 10 times, I've seen that 50 times.
I like the Don Siegel who tells the truth, has a really interesting view of humanity, has a peculiar kind of austere style, both as a director, but I think also about what the truth was in a scene, cuts out the sentiment, goes straight to story. That's what I love about Don Siegel.
Charley Varrick, Last of the Independents. I like that. There's a ring of finality.
My name is Kristoffer Tabori. I'm Don Siegel's son. He was married to my mother, Vivica Lindfors. They met at Warner Brothers doing a pretty interesting film, and she immediately fell in love with my father, which was great because it produced me, I guess. It was my mother's first film in the United States, but the third film to be released because the studio was worried that Ronald Reagan was going to get blacklisted. So that's an interesting bit of something or other, given where Ronald Reagan ended up on the political scale. When Charley Varrick was being made, I was working as a young actor and doing quite well, quite successful, toggling between New York and Los Angeles, and obviously when I was out here, I'd see my dad. I remember him being very excited about this film. Charley Varrick was produced after Dirty Harry, so it was sort of in his golden age, where his work was being taken seriously and he had a little more control.
The first project my dad worked on with Don Siegel was a policier called Madigan, and it was where his relationship with Don was formed, which was both a very satisfying relationship and a very tempestuous one. Madigan was about the police commissioner of New York and his trusted lieutenant and a kind of flashy, slightly corrupt cop, played by Richard Widmark. The commissioner himself was played by Henry Fonda. It was a great cast, based on a really good, tough, gritty novel called The Commissioner. But at a certain point, my father either was onto another project, or Don decided he couldn't do any more on it, or my dad walked away. And so my dad recommended Abe Polonsky, who was a friend of his, who was a blacklisted writer and director. But just before the film came out, my father said, "Take my name off, I'm using my pseudonym." His pseudonym was Henri Simoun, Simoun being a hot wind. And in fact, his pseudonym, Henri Simoun, appears on a huge number of things. So they worked together very happily on Madigan when they weren't fighting. And as a result, they worked together on another film called Coogan's Bluff. Coogan's Bluff was also policier. It's about an Arizona cop played by Clint Eastwood, who comes to New York to extradite a prisoner who escaped from his custody. The New York cop, played by Lee J. Cobb, doesn't like him, doesn't really understand him, keeps saying, "This isn't your town, Tex." And Clint Eastwood, of course, keeps saying, "Arizona."
My first collaboration with Don Siegel was around 1968 in a movie he directed called Coogan's Bluff. First of all, I was inhibited because I was overwhelmed by his presence. And I did tell him this afterwards, I didn't really understand the film too well. I mean, I understood the whole thing but there were some sequences and some scenes that I didn't know whether he had a way of shooting people faces that they were strange to me. Obviously, I was wrong, but I kept going and I did it. This was the first of the urban thrillers I've done with him. Also, at the time of Coogan's Bluff, I met Clint Eastwood, who was very important in the whole history of Don Siegel's films. Clint Eastwood was one of the main actor, I think. And he was a very nice guy. He loved music. As a matter, he did like jazz, and so I felt very comfortable with him.
I met Don Siegel through his son, Chris Tabori. Chris Tabori and I were colleagues in New York theater. We'd done some work together. And Don came to New York and asked, when Don was casting, looking for the killer in Dirty Harry, he asked Chris, with Don's typical irony, who's the best actor in New York? And Chris, I don't know, Chris must have been stoned or something, said that Andy Robinson was. And so that's how I got a meeting with Don. And at the time, I was doing a play at the New York Shakespeare Festival, but Don couldn't come and see it. And so we had this meeting, and Don said, "I'm sorry, I can't see your play, but my son tells me you're a terrific actor," and that was pretty much the meeting. And I thought that was it. And then a couple of weeks later, Clint Eastwood came to the play, and then I got hired to do Dirty Harry. But if it hadn't been for Chris, you know, my relationship with Don probably never would have happened.
My memory is that my father's first choice for the killer in Dirty Harry was Rip Torn, and there was some reason they couldn't get Rip. I knew Rip very well also. And I had talked to him about Andy Robinson. You know, obviously he was really right for that part in Dirty Harry, and he was fantastic in it.
When I did get the role and we started working together, I asked Don, I said, you know, this guy is really a gruesome, murderous, insane person. I mean, why did you hire me? Is that what you see me as? And he said, no. He said quite, you know, straight for Don, I wanted somebody who looked like a choir boy.
Andy comes out of Greenwich Village and East Village Experimental Theater. He was working at places like Cafe La Mama. and when he kind of got discovered and brought out to Hollywood. I think what really accounted for his career was really the two Don Siegel films, Dirty Harry and Charley Varrick. Very different parts, very different portrayals, and Andy has the ability to disappear into a part. So if you look at him in Dirty Harry, you think he's really like that guy. But then I saw a TV movie in which he played Liberace impeccably. I think Andy's Liberace is as good as the Michael Douglas Liberace.
When Don invited me over to Warner Brothers to see, it wasn't more than a rough cut of Dirty Harry. It was pretty much the finished film. I was astounded. The film was epic. It's a huge film. And my performance was, it was the first time I'd really seen myself on film. And I felt like somebody had hit me over the head. But I was pleased. I was really pleased that the ideas that I came up with, I was able to execute.
Dirty Harry was one of the greatest successes in the history of filmmaking. In these kind of films of murder, mystery, police action, it was extremely successful. There was also an element of controversy in the film because some of the critics, they said it was a fascist movie. That was a difficult thing, and the controversy was difficult. And of course, as a musician, I had to stay neutral of this problem. I had to let Don Siegel and Clint Eastwood solve it, and let Andy Robinson keep doing the killings.
But then Don, when after the screening, said to me, laughingly, in that, again, ironic way of his, he said, "I've probably ruined your career." And I laughed. I thought he was being just Don. But in a way, it's not that he ruined my career, but certainly it was hard for anyone to see me as other than a psychopathic killer. So thankfully, the next film that I did was Charley Varrick. Don hired me again the following year. And when he called me about the film, he said, "Listen, this guy he's not a choir boy, but he's not crazy. He's just a regular, good old, greedy kind of bank robber sort of person." But I was pleased because I loved working with him, and I was overjoyed to work with him again.
To work with Andy Robinson, I just befriended him immediately. He's a very intelligent man, a very fine actor, and Don adored this guy. There was no way Andy was not going to be in this movie after Dirty Harry.
The third film that my dad worked on with Don Siegel was Charley Varrick. Charley Varrick is based on a book called The Looters by John Reese. Universal did a lot of that. They optioned books that they thought would make, good movies. I mean, I don't think they were at that time calling them B movies, but they were. In the same way that they had optioned The Commissioner by Richard Doherty, they optioned The Looters by John Reese. And my father's task was to adapt the book. I've read the book, although not for a while. The book is a nice little tough neo-noir. I think more like people like Lionel White and Peter Rabe than people on the level of, Goodis or Thompson or Richard Stark. But it's the kind of book that filmmakers can make really nice films from. I think of Lionel White's Clean Break that became the Kubrick movie The Killing, or the Dolores Hitchens novel Fool's Gold that became Band of Outsiders. It's that kind of a book. There's enough there so that a filmmaker with a vision can make something pretty cool out of it. My father said that when it was originally contemplated, it was going to be a pretty rough and tough movie, which I think it still is. And it was going to be with Donald Sutherland. And one of the exhibitors called up and called someone at Universal, called somebody else and said, Radio City Music Hall needs a movie for Easter. So if it's a movie for Easter, it has to be, at least in some sense, a family entertainment. And they felt they could accomplish that by replacing Donald Sutherland, who was a kind of wonderful, edgy, off-center actor of enormous talent, with Walter Matthau, who was at least up to that point considered a family-friendly actor of enormous talent. My father had his doubts about whether Walter Matthau, who he thought of as a kind of warm, fuzzy guy who had a very wry sense of humor, and you can certainly see that in his work with Wilder, you can certainly see that in his work in something like Charade. My father had his doubts as to whether Walter Matthau could step up to a part that, at least as he envisioned it, was pretty dark.
When Donald Sutherland fell through, I was really happy to hear that Walter Matthau was going to do it, because as far as I was concerned, he was a real screen giant. People who don't know Walter's career think that it was unusual for him to play Charley Varrick, but if you look at his earlier career, he played several villains. It's common knowledge, everyone knows that Walter had a gambling habit, and it was a serious habit that he had to control. And one day I said to him, how did you ever become a star? Because you're a great actor, but you're a character actor. You do these various characters, and you don't look like Clint Eastwood or Paul Newman or any of those guys. And he says, well, I'll tell you what. I became a star because one day I got a call from my bookie. And my bookie said, Walter, what do you want? You want your arms broken or your legs broken? So Walter, at that point, realized that he had to come up with a lot of money fast. And so he said he took every job that was ever offered to him. And if you look at old television series, American television, he'll pop up as the bad guy. And so when it came time to Charley Varrick, I mean, he was a great actor. Of course, he was a comedian. He was a light comedian. He had finesse. He had such grace and ease in front of the camera. But he could also be he was also a very serious actor.
My father, when he saw the finished film, was knocked out by Matthau's performance because the hard edge was there in a way that I think we've rarely seen from Matthau before. But also the heart of Matthau really makes you root for that character, even when he's doing pretty despicable things. And that's a hard line to find, and I think Matthau found it, and my dad was very happy that he did. He was ready and poised to take his name off again, but when he saw the film, said, no, I'm proud of this, which for him was very rare.
We were on the set of Charley Varrick, and this blonde, long-haired guy with a beard walked up to me, and he introduced himself, and when he said Michael Butler, I said, you're the DP? Strikingly good-looking guy. And he was brilliant. He was a brilliant DP. He's a lighting DP. I mean, that's an art. You know, like Vittorio Storaro, I did like 4 films with. Michael was every bit as good as Vittorio. And Michael was Don Siegel's godson, you know, but he wasn't hired because he was his godson. He was hired because he was a very, very good DP. And I feel lucky to have worked with he and Don on the same picture, because you were part of their family, and they made magic.
Watching the movie last night and trying to distill what it was that really made this movie, I think, a remarkable film, a seminal movie in its genre, which is, you know, sort of what, crime drama, anti-hero crime drama. First off, the setting is fantastic. You're immediately in both a normal and dangerous world. You just feel it right from the start.
The credits to the film are all it's sort of like this bucolic, easy rhythm of sprinklers going off, kids running.
It's sort of hokey America, Midwest, and yet there's a kind of odd, discordant feel to it. You know, clearly you're watching a Don Siegel film, you know something bad is going to happen.
It's in the countryside in Nevada. It's very sweet. And then there's this, you know, gentle music, Lalo Schifrin's gentle music.
He sets the tone beautifully, you know, and his ability, for all his control and, you know, enormous specificity as a director. And it's interesting reading Don's notes in his book, his ability to use what happens. You know, they're off doing camera tests and they start shooting my little brother and little sisters, you know, running through fountains and, you know, mowing lawns. And then that great shot, I had no idea that it was Walter Matthau's son trying to put the saddle on the burro. It's just gorgeous stuff. And of course, it's a really brilliant filmmaker who has the courage to use that, you know, not get sort of, you know, dogmatic about, well, that's not what it says on page 1, you know, scene 1. So there are those elements to it. There's my father's ability, his skill, his great skill to be able to improvise within his construct. So he finds a world that is both disturbing and normal.
And then this car, this yellow car shows up and pulls up in front of a bank. The bank where we shot was in this little, very small town. I mean, barely a town. I mean, if you were driving through, if you closed your eyes, you'd miss it.
A little old, sleepy, lazy town called Minden, Nevada, just outside of Carson City.
But there was this little bank there. It was a real bank. And it was really quite near where the actors, where we stayed, where we were living. I remember that Jacqueline Scott, who played Charley Varrick's wife and who was driving the car, Nadine, that's right, Nadine. And we, you know, it's like that was the first scene we shot. So I had just met, we'd all just met each other. And it's like one of those things, you just meet each other, okay, let's go to work, you know, and so it's always, and beginnings, as Confucius says, are hard. But Jacqueline was a very, very sweet woman, lovely woman, totally without ego.
Listen, why don't you let me park the car and then you endorse the check and I'll go in and cash it?
Well, I go in and cash my own check. It's my check, isn't it? And I'm going to endorse it and cash it myself.
I think he's afraid I'm going to abscond with the money.
My God, you know, this is the first time I finally got to work with Walter Matthau because I just idolized him as an actor.
Nobody said you were an old crock.
Well, you implied it.
So we get for the first shot, and Walter and Don Siegel are going to figure out how they're going to maneuver this and open the car door and how he's going to get out. So I put my 2 cents in, and I said, well, maybe we can. They just both ignored me. So I thought, whoops. So I didn't make any more contributions. But they weren't rude, either one of them. But they just ignored me. Just the little thing of be quiet over there. And the next day, Walter comes back from the dailies. He says, Jackie, you're a good actor. And after that, you know, his attitude toward me was totally different. Well, that made me feel good.
Morning.
Good morning, sir.
Another thing about that opening bank robbery scene, there was a bank guard. And the actor's name is Bob Steele. Bob Steele was one of my childhood heroes. He was a big cowboy star. And it was astonishing. I mean, I don't think he had any lines. I think Don gave him the job as a favor. So we're working, I walk into the bank, and I look at this guy who's playing the bank guard, and I said to him, are you Bob Steele? And the guy, he was kind of shocked that I knew who he was. And he said, yeah. I said, oh my God. Because the guy was a great cowboy. And then, bam! Once they get inside that bank, the rhythms completely change. I mean, the cutting, the violence of the editing. And of what happens, and how people rob banks.
Ingmar Bergman said that filmmaking is very similar to magic. you have to make believe things. And in this case, we have to make believe that there was a complete, and it was, a complete change of the atmosphere, abrupt. There was no transition, it was abrupt.
The hardest thing for me to do physically in that film was when I jumped through the teller's window. And I was wearing these cowboy boots and these tight corduroy pants. And it was like, it was terrible. And then in one take, my ass, the ass of my pants totally ripped out. And so we had to change my pants and whatever.
The bank robbery, which is a major set piece in Charley Varrick. It set up the entire movie, obviously. It was shot in Gardnerville and Minden. It took, I think, about, well, actually, we did 2 days exterior there.
I guarantee you that Don and Dean Reisner, the writer, were constantly saying, how do you rob a bank? What are the things you need to do? How do you, the wiping down of the counter by Andy Robinson when he comes through, all of the details of how you can get away with this, all of the planning, what you reveal to the audience, what you don't reveal to the audience to get ahead of them, and then have them go, fantastic, brilliant.
San Miguel 4, this is Rudy.
San Miguel 4. Go ahead, Jesse.
Looks like you've got something.
The woman who is just reporting the calls into at the police station, who I think was an old girlfriend of his before he met my mother, and they all remained friends. All very good performances.
And that was a very dangerous, very high tension situation. Because the cops had already been there, remember. They had already come, and we fooled him that time. And he was in there a long time, goddammit, It wasn't like he went in and ran back like we thought it would be. So you had to be aware of, not only what was behind you, anything that's coming behind you, or on the sides, or in the front, or...
Morning, ma'am.
Morning.
May I see your driver's license, please?
Very tense danger in that scene. When the cop was shot in the face, the guy who actually shot him was lying in the back seat of the car. And, he shot him right between the eyes. And with a blood pellet would explode once he hit it. But to see guns and all those fake bullets and stuff like that, they can hurt you. I mean, that guy had a bruise on his face for the rest of the week while I was there. Stunts. It took almost a whole week to set that scene up with that driving and everything. It was so complicated.
The thing that's wonderful about filmmaking is when something totally unexpected happens and you have to deal with it. And the great unexpected thing was when the Varrick car runs into the cop car. The hood went up. We had to go with that. We had to finish to do all the driving with the hood up.
The stuntman had to drive blind with that hood.
The stunt coordinator who designed all the stunts was this guy, Paul Baxley. And he was really an old-time stunt director. He was brilliant. His son, Craig, also worked on it.
I was called in. I got there. Most of the stunt guys were already on the set by the time the bank robbery, which was the first real action set piece which was to be done.
The stuntmen were they're unbelievable.
Don and my father were very, very good friends. My father goes back Coogan's Bluff with Clint Eastwood. He did for Don. He did Telfon with Don. They were great friends, and Don trusted my father, Paul Baxley, to do entire sequences. He was very comfortable with him, and when he knew somebody knew their craft like Paul did, and he knew Paul so well, he would just delegate that sequence to Paul. Paul originally wanted me to drive the police car, but I was on another movie, I couldn't get off it, so he had a stuntman named Dean Jeffries drive the police car. We had a little bit of a disagreement that day because Dean had sold Paul on this idea that he could turn a car over by throwing it sideways, hitting a telephone pole that was in the ground sideways, and it would flip the car. And so Paul had sold Don Siegel on this concept. I got there, and I'd just come off of a pretty big car show, and I looked at it, and I went to Paul, and I said, "This is never going to happen." I said, "This is just not going to happen." And he said, "What are you talking about? Dean says he can do this." I said, "No, if anything, he's going to shear the wheels off." But they were set in their ways. I got there the day before it, so Paul puts me, just to get me in the sequence, in the passenger seat with Dean, Dean was a car builder, but he was also a stuntman. And the car was supposed to come down the hill, get hit by the car, and go sideways, hit this log, and turn over through this market. And they had 3 cameras in the market. We came down the hill about 30 miles an hour too fast. Paul was right where he was supposed to be. We hit, but Dean never got it sideways, so instead of turning over going through the market, he hit the log and got airborne, and we went right by the market and crashed into a parked car. So it was a stunt gone wrong, but Don loved it because it looked real. Paul would probably be very angry with me right now for telling the story, but unfortunately my father passed away 2 years ago. And I'm one that always, if I do something, I'm going to be very honest about how it happened. And the fact that everybody was thrilled with the way it went down, even though it was a stunt gone wrong, hey, cut your losses, and they did. And it looked great in the movie. And my father, who was the stunt coordinator and second unit director on the show, in those days they didn't give second unit directors credit, but he doubled Jacqueline Scott driving the car in the getaway. And it was pretty interesting, you know, with the wig on and everything else, because my father, you know, was a pretty good-looking guy. He doubled Brando for years and Alan Ladd. And, but he put the wig on, he looked pretty good. You know, he had the wardrobe and he had all the endowments. And I played a character, Deputy Van Sickle, who was in the police car that had some dialogue after the crash with William Schott, who was the sheriff.
How is he? He's alive, anyway.
But Don, I mean, he just, very minimalistic, the way he filmed action. And it was like he subscribed to, I want it to be real. I don't want it to look like a stunt sequence per se. And I defy anyone to say anything about the action in that movie. Yes, it was made in 1972, and it's a little dated now, but it looked real.
People think because it's a stunt, it's not real. And it is real. It's dangerous. And that was a big, big stunt. They took almost the whole week to block that scene. And this little boy was sitting in the swing, swinging all week long. And all of a sudden, they do the first run-through, and those guns went off, and that car shot out of there, and that kid got off that swing, and he wasn't coming back. He went home. And there was no way they were going to get him back in there. So everybody immediately said, "Oh, your little boy is that age. He looks like that little boy." I thought about that when you brought him on the set, because I had my sons with me. And so I said, no, I won't put him in that shot, because I just felt it was too high emotion. So I wouldn't let him do it. So then Walter let his son do it. And his son was a little older.
I got their license. GA1472.
No, it's GA1742.
Right, GA1742.
By the way, it's not an opening sequence. It's the first act. It goes all the way to 30 minutes into the film. The first 30 minutes are the bank robbery and the aftermath of the robbery. And that's really remarkable.
Hey, come on, Charlie. We just can't sit here all day.
Charlie, what?
Easy, all right. We'll get you to a doctor, Nadine.
There is a funny story of that wig, because I looked completely different. It just totally radically changed my look. And I, as a young girl, had gorgeous auburn hair. and I still had the gorgeous auburn hair at that time. But they were supposed to put me in a blonde wig, and I said I looked like Bert Lahr and the Wizard of Oz, you know, when they and it depressed me, so I really looked like him. So they put the black wig on me, and I looked, as I said, radically different. And at the end of shooting, and I'd go in, you know, at 6 o'clock in the morning, and they'd put that wig on me and everything. So at the end of the day, I went up to one of the drivers, and who I'd been talking to all day long, and I said, okay, I'm ready to go home. And he looked at me like I was crazy, you know, and he said, what? He had no idea who I was when he looked at me without that wig. That funny? Had a hard time getting a ride home that day.
Charley discovers that Nadine is mortally wounded. And there's a moment there, a very sweet, gentle moment between Charley and Nadine.
When you look at how his wife dies, and that moment he has with her, it's without sentiment. It's with emotion, but it's without sentiment. And that, I thought, was a very interesting choice. That's a real Don Siegel choice. That is a real Don Siegel choice. And that, you know, I think that's what makes Don Siegel films interesting, is that he gets to that precipice and he finds a really interesting way to navigate around that scene so that we're watching it differently.
Charlie?
We're not watching a sort of emotional kind of thing and an actor having a little showpiece. We're seeing something that reveals character in an interesting way and hits a loss differently than we normally see. And it becomes kind of thrilling and beautifully framed, you know, through the car door.
When Walter took the ring off my finger, that was my own wedding ring.
You see this kind of passage point of saying goodbye to her in a funny way without hurt. Kind of an acceptance that, hey, mea culpa, this is what happens in life. I thought that was great.
I was already dead when he did that, when he kissed me. And that wasn't in the script. And it almost made me cry, and I thought, oh my God, I can't cry, I'm dead. And I had a terrible time because I didn't know he was going to do it. So, yeah, it was really something. It was a beautiful thing, you know, that he did there.
You're right, Harmon. She's finished.
This is a very pragmatic guy. And it makes you know, watch out for this guy. This is a smart man. This is a dangerous guy. This is a guy who, who can take on an enormous opposition like the entire mafia. I mean, that was a really revelatory scene.
But then the rhythm picks up. It picks up because they got to get the hell out of there. They got to transfer the money into the van. They put the black powder around the car and set the fuse. And then they get back out onto the road, and then the music, everything changes. The rhythm again changes. And so you've got that scene. I'm playing the harmonica. And I told Don, I said, please don't dub me with the harmonica. I don't know how to play the harmonica. I play obviously terribly. So that when he says, I used to do this professionally, it would be a laugh.
You know, I used to make my living playing this thing.
Okay, play it.
Professionally.
But then they dubbed me. They gave me some, and it really was so silly. That was the only thing I wish he hadn't done. But anyway.
Look at that.
What?
Up ahead.
Walter's driving, Andy's in the passenger seat, and Don wanted to be with them and see this police car go by at 100 miles an hour and throw 180 out the back window. And Paul walked up and said, Craig, get in the car. And I said, okay, what's up? And he explained it to me. And I said, you know, this is up there, like in Carson City, some of these places, they have these culverts on each side of the road. So it's a 2-lane road with a drop-off on each side. And I said, you want me to go down this road 100 miles an hour and snap a 180? And then Paul says, do you think you can do it? Well, I said, okay. And we set it up. They had the cameras inside, and I took off flying down this highway. And I locked it up, going straight. And then you see the car just snap and come around. Thank God it stayed on the road, and I came back after him. So we did it.
Don't make any stupid moves, will you?
All right, well, let me tell you. He starts snooping around in the back here. I'm gonna blow his snout off.
And then when the cop stops us, the hill is way in the background, so we had to coordinate with the explosion.
Something wrong, officer?
When finally the fuse goes off and the car blows up. And so it really did happen that way. We're in the middle of the scene and bang. But of course, obviously, the bang happened. The real bang happens when they're shooting across the van and Charlie and the cop, and you see the explosion in the background. That explosion was, setting that up was very delicate because they had to do it, obviously they were in contact with each other over walkie-talkies and whatever. And plus there was a shitload of fire people because we were shooting in the summer. It was dry. And really, it was a real explosion. So basically, they had to be prepared for any fire that would happen.
The blowing up of the car, that great, ticking bomb, where they set it up that it's going to blow. We're waiting for it to blow. We don't understand why it hasn't blown, right? And then they get stopped by a cop car. Oh my God, if that thing blows, we're really going to be in trouble. And then how brilliantly it becomes a comic device for the cop to go, shit, the problem's over there.
God damn.
And it actually saves them. That's really brilliant filmmaking. I was in awe. I was in awe. He was fantastic at finding these kind of cool little, sort of director showmanship moments.
Goodbye, Nadine.
Harmon was not the Scorpio killer from Dirty Harry. And Walter Matthau was not Clint Eastwood. It was an entirely different working experience with Walter. Walter came from the theater, as I did. And Walter liked to rehearse. And we were constantly running lines a lot. Don didn't like to rehearse that much. Don would rehearse, but only to get the camera angle, to make sure that the lighting was correct. He always told me what's going on in the frame. That was his direction. He never told me how to play the character. When I came up with an idea that he liked, he went with it. If it was an idea that he didn't like, he'd say, no, don't do that. So Walter and I would go off, and we would go back and forth with the scene. There was not a lot of improvisation because the script was really very tight. I think the script was extremely well written. But for instance, the long scene that Walter and I had in the trailer.
Charlie?
After the bank robbery, we come back to the trailer and we open up and we realize there's an enormous amount of money in the bag.
Oh, what's the matter? You're not going to tell me it's counterfeit, are you?
No, it's good.
Oh, money.
And that scene, which is a long scene in which my character is so happy.
We lucked out.
More like crapped out. It's 10 to 1. This stuff belongs to the mafia. This is gambling money, skimmed off the top. Whore money, dope money.
What's the difference?
When you're working on a character, you're looking for that trigger. You're looking for the motor for that character. And here's this kid who's white trash, good-looking kid, not very bright, gets a job as a crop duster, falls in with this guy Charley Varrick. They figure they need some money. They'll knock over this bank, get maybe a few $1,000s. And this is a kid who's had nothing all his life. And then suddenly there's this enormous amount of money. It would, in today's dollars, it would have been millions of dollars. And of course, it just turns him around. I mean, he's absolutely blinded by this.
I've been waiting all my life to make a score like this. And now that it's here, I ain't waiting no more. I mean, I'm gonna wail. And I'm talking about chicks, cars, clothes, a box at the races, and beefsteak 3 times a day, and no washed up, chicken shit. Son of a bitch, you'd better try stop me.
And that's the scene when Charley Varrick realizes that Harmon is dangerous, that if Harmon has his way, the cops will soon find out who robbed the bank.
Okay, kid, you're calling it.
Well, that scene, we spent a couple of days on that scene, and we're working in this very small trailer, into a real trailer. It was like a screwball comedy, without the comedy. And in a sense, yes, I was his Jack Lemmon. But it was easy to be his partner because he gave so much. He really spoke to you, he listened. He was a consummate actor. He understood what the craft was about. At one point, he said to me, he said, "What am I doing in this film?" He says, I'm terrible in this film. I mean, you know, they should have gotten somebody like Charles Bronson or somebody to do this. And I said, "What are you talking about? You're fucking great in this film. Are you kidding me?"
I think Andy's performance is not as showy as Matthau's, it's not as central, but if you don't believe the relationship between those two, then the movie doesn't work, and you believe it.
For me, the movie is about a guy navigating himself out of a problem that he didn't know he created for himself and finding a more brilliant way than we would ever expect or we can anticipate for him to navigate himself out of it and not lose the money, right, which is the goal in the film. Part of what's great in the movie is that he's got a double threat. He's both got the legit people after him and he's got obviously the mafia after him. And I thought all the little touches of planning, of detail, you know, gave it so much vitality. I mean, you could have done that sequence of a bank robbery and blowing up the car and their escape. I guarantee you could have done it in 5 minutes. It's more than just the tease to get you into the movie. It's a highly complex event in which he sets up, you know, the problems between Andy Robinson and Walter Matthau, all sorts of aspects of Matthau's character, you know, this kind of strange, both brilliant but disconnected guy. It's like he's cut off on some level. So he's a perfect Don Siegel hero. So there's great setup of character, great setup of his past. So he's able to extend what is essentially sort of a cold opening, you know, a crime that then is going to, you know, for which there's then going to be a pursuit. He extends it all the way through the first act. I mean, the entrance of John Vernon in, you know, wherever he is, Reno or something like that, is the beginning of the second act.
A Western Fidelity branch bank of Tres Cruces, New Mexico, was robbed of roughly $750,000. The size of the take, plus the urgency of the situation, makes it inevitable that I should call upon you to become personally involved. All the arrangements will be the same as last time. I hope and fully expect the same kind of results.
The introduction of John Vernon and Joe Don Baker and how they get integrated in the story is brilliant.
The thing that I love about Charley Varrick is the quality of the acting and the character acting. Tom Tully.
I don't sell paper. I make my living selling guns.
Hello, this is Sybil.
Felicia Farr, Woody Parfrey.
That's all there is. It's a very small town, sir.
Norman Fell.
Is Harold Young under suspicion?
Suspicion of what?
These were part of Don Siegel's repertory company.
Suspicion of collusion and robbery. Please don't talk down to me.
John Vernon, I thought it's one of the best things I've seen him do in all those films he did with my father. I like him in the movie. I think he's very interesting. Difficult part.
Yeah?
Hi.
Hi.
Sherry North.
Are you the photographer?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, everybody was crazy about her.
That's the performance in the movie. Sherry North is the performance in the movie. That is an amazing, that's a study in how to play that scene.
No offense, but people who need passports in a hurry are generally in trouble.
You get shot between now and then, I get stuck. You understand?
Her specificity, her simplicity, her subdued sexuality, her ability to throw the dialogue away, her incredible pride in her characterization. It looks so simple what she's doing, and I'm telling you, that is, for me, the best performance.
And that's going to cost you $500 extra.
And these were all people who understood. One of the things about acting is that you have to understand what the story is and what your part in the story is.
You know what my favorite moment is? My favorite moment is, it's also brilliantly directed. Joe Don Baker has just seen Tom Tully, and you see a long shot of Joe Don Baker, and you're not quite sure where he is. And as he goes left to right and the camera pans with him, you realize you're on the reverse of the stairs that lead up to Sherry North. The normal way you would do this, you've already established Walter Matthau walking up those stairs, and you'd bring Joe Don Baker, and he'd walk up those stairs. And you'd go, oh, now he's there. What was so brilliant about crossing the line and getting onto the other side of the stairs is there are about 5 moments prior to his approaching the stairs. We don't know where Joe Don Baker is. And then we go, oh my God, it's the other side of the stairs. I mean, that is elegant film directing. By the way, the one thing absolutely has to be acknowledged in this movie, because it's a real Don Siegel infusion, is the fact that nobody in the mafia is Italian. You know, that he used Benson Fong, who owned the famous restaurant here in Los Angeles, as one of the mafia guys.
If you should find there's some sort of leak inside the organization, that information would be very valuable.
And John Vernon, who's like, you know, Mr. White Guy, and there's Biff Parfrey with the English accent. And, you know, I mean, it was such a conscientious choice. And again, I thought a very clever one. And finally, to have Joe Don Baker be the hitman, you know, that was, I mean, that was, and brilliant. And giving him the pipe, you know, which was a Don Siegel pipe.
I painted her, up her belly and down her back, every crevice and every crack.
What else do I think is remarkable I see all through that film is my father's rather sublime, odd, guarded sense of humor, infusing itself all the time into the film. You know, sometimes a little too overtly. I personally might have addressed the film logic of having Don Siegel playing table tennis and losing. You know, I mean, I went like, really? Really? We have to stop the movie for Don Siegel making a joke about himself because he was a famous table tennis player? You know, that I'm not sure I agree with, because I think the film's better than that.
Pleasure to do business with you, Bert.
Thanks, you creep.
But the marvelous sense of humor he has all through the movie, you know, marvelous little weird jokes that he plays with Joe Don Baker.
When I wake, I appreciate 2 3.5-minute eggs, piece of dry whole wheat toast, and a pot of hot herb tea.
Okay. If there's anything we can do for your pleasure, Jana's a nice girl.
I don't sleep with whores, at least not knowingly.
And Joe Don Baker's kind of odd, weird irony all through the film. Those are such Don Siegel choices. You know, I'm not saying that Joe Don Baker didn't bring that to the movie, but it's how Don, you know, would give room for it and give access to those choices. That's the brilliance of Don. Andy's character always sort of one-upping and threatening a sort of passive Walter Matthau set the stage for the betrayal of Andy Robinson.
Ain't you supposed to be some kind of hot dog stunt pilot?
Yeah, it's been a long time since I've done any fancy flying. I kind of lose your neck.
Well, you better find it again in a hurry. Because if you can't do that, Jimmy Dick, what use are you?
We were willing to accept that, you know, Andy was a schmuck, and it was okay to let him take the fall because he would never have been smart enough or generous enough or trusting enough to sort of follow, you know, Matthau and whatever his plan was.
The film is not a sentimental film because Charley does sacrifice Harmon to survive. And that's what I love about it. It's not sentimental. That's the way these things go. Harmon's great flaw, besides his greed, was that he wasn't very bright. And that set him up for what happened to him, his demise. You know, and in a sense, it's a morality tale because he gets, you know, what he deserves in a sense.
Thank you. Sure sorry I disturbed you.
Shooting that scene with Joe Don Baker in the trailer was horrendous. I hated doing that scene.
Take it you're Mr. Sullivan, huh? Mr. Harmon Sullivan?
Yeah, that's right.
It was like basically just sadomasochism. I mean, you know, from the time he opens the door, lets the guy in, and then it's just an execution, a slow, torturous execution. I'll never forget that night because we shot all night long until the dawn.
Harmon, where's the money? You're busting my ribs.
And I was so sore because as in Dirty Harry, I did my own stunts. I was very young and limber and strong and acrobatic. And Don loved that. He didn't have to get a stunt man. So I did my own stunts. If I was punched, if I was thrown, if I was flipped over, that was me. And we did it over and over and over again, and it was like miserable. And I didn't have much of a relationship with Joe Don. I mean, he was a guy who kept his own counsel and whatever. So it wasn't necessary. Whereas it was a wonderful exchange that Walter and I had. But in terms of Joe Don, the exchange was very different.
My patience is wearing thin. If I don't get some satisfaction from you soon, I want to start hurting you very badly.
I hated that scene.
Where's Varrick?
I don't know, man.
Hated watching it. It's like I hated watching the scene in Dirty Harry in the football stadium when Dirty Harry sticks his foot into the killer's wound to get the information about the dying girl. It was the same thing about that scene with Joe Don Baker. It was a painful thing to watch.
I remember that I had to come with a team that would convey. The only thing I could convey was Charley Varrick's mind. Because he doesn't talk to anybody. He doesn't say, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. He doesn't say anything. So I came with a pulse. The mind is working. The mind is working, and every time that you hear that pulse, which was one of an instrument invented here in Hollywood by Hollywood musicians, percussionists. It's called flapamba, which is a mixture of marimba and I don't know what. It's a very interesting sound. It was very interesting, and I used it, and Don liked it, obviously. There's only one character. It's Charley Varrick. And as I said, the flapamba, the pulse of that instrument, which is very subdued. It's not on the nose. It's not a big. It's not cymbals with trumpet. No. In the contrary, it's his brain.
The end sequence in the junkyard with the biplane, Don came up with this idea, which I thought was brilliant, that it takes place in this junkyard. So what they did, they rented a real junkyard. And we started filming, and we had to go away and shoot something else, and we were going to go back, but the owner of the junkyard said, oh, no, no, no. You want to come back to my location? You're going to have to pay me 3-4 times what you paid originally. So it was basically highway robbery. And Don Siegel looked at his first director, Joe Cavalier, who was brilliant, consummate first AD, and said, listen, that's my location. We're supposed to have that locked up. Joe said, don't worry about a thing. We're not going to pay a penny for that location. So Joe went out and got transportation, and they rebuilt that junkyard on a different spot. It wasn't the same junkyard. You see 2 different junkyards in the movie, and which I thought was amazing. Paul had hired probably the finest stunt pilot in the history of cinema, a guy named Frank Tallman.
Frank Tallman, who was legendary, who did all of the great airplane stunts in Hollywood.
And Frank was doubling Walter Matthau, and he was supposed to ground loop this biplane, which Don Siegel said, listen, you know, I can't spend all day doing this. You know, how difficult is this, to Frank? And Paul said, give him a rehearsal. So Frank went and got in his biplane and came flying up this road and ground looped it, flipped it right on top. And Paul says, is that good enough to Don? Don said, okay. So they righted it, didn't damage it at all, and they did the same thing in the movie. The sequence in the junkyard was, I think, a classic sequence, the cat and mouse with the biplane and the car. Paul Baxley drove the car, and Frank Tallman obviously flew the biplane, taxied the biplane. It was interesting because Don, once again, didn't want it to look too stunty. So Paul really, you know, he wasn't necessarily throwing the car sideways, he was powering the car. He was driving the car like he wanted to kill the airplane, which I thought was kind of an interesting concept. So it was like, it felt like that's what was going on. It didn't feel like, you know, your usual, in those days I did, you know, like 5 police stories, and they wanted these ultimate car chases and this and that, but this was not that. This was a dramatic action piece where 2 men were trying to kill each other with their respective vehicles. And Frank had worked with Paul through the years so many times that they knew each other so well, and Paul knew Frank so well. So a lot of that was choreographed, but then they would capitalize on certain moments when Frank would like loop that plane and Paul would loop the car, and then suddenly Don's going, oh, this is magic, and Don would jump back in and cover it. But again, Don's style was very minimalist. That's where, you know, Clint Eastwood comes from Don Siegel.
Don Siegel came to me and said, how are you going to do this? I do think that we can do it. Shall I use only sound effects for the car? I can do that, he says. But I would like to have music, but if you can, I don't know if you can do music in a chase between the airplane and car. So I said, let me listen to that. I have a good year. And if I can find the frequencies of the airplane and the car, maybe I can come up with something. And he liked that. So I came up with frequencies that match the frequencies of the airplane and the frequency of the car. And then I wrote changed music like I would write for any film. But it was the idea that 2 different frequencies, and he was very pleased. The audience cannot analyze that. I mean, nobody could, except Don Siegel and me. But we had to, the idea of music for films is to create this subconscious, this has to be subtle, has to be all instrumental, and it has to be all directed to the heart of the audience.
The script did diverge from the novel, The Looters. In the novel, Charlie is killed by Molly. But in the movie, the writers, I think, came up with an ingenious ending. And it really, it so elevated the character of Charley Varrick with what he did with the dental records. and how he outsmarted Molly in a genuine way, not in some way that was like formulaic, which a lot of films, to make the hero look good, they'll make the hero look good in a very banal, pedestrian way. This wasn't pedestrian. It was ingenious. Originally the film was called The Looters, and then Don wanted to call it The Last of the Independents. And the studio wouldn't let him, because now that they had Walter Matthau, who was a big star, they wanted to call it, obviously, Charley Varrick.
One of the things that I like best about the film Charley Varrick is the way that it really assumes that the audience is smart, assumes that if you hold the audience in your grip well enough, there will be things that you don't understand the first time around, but that you have enough faith that you will understand them either by the time the film's over or upon a second viewing. One of the things that I try to teach my screenwriting students, and one of the things I try to do in my own work, is you want to write a film that viewed forward is continuously surprising, and viewed backward seems inevitable. That's really, really hard to do, and I think Charley Varrick is one of the few films that actually, in its own quiet way, hits those marks impeccably. As you're watching it, there are little pieces of exposition that you don't know are exposition. There are little plot twists that you're not aware are plot twists. But then at the end, all of a sudden, there's the trunk and there's the bomb, and you get it. And all of it falls together, and you realize the motivation for all of those 4 or 5 little things that you didn't quite understand. It's like, oh yes, that's what he was doing. And then you're happy, and then the movie ends. When Clint Eastwood talks about Don Siegel as among his mentors, I see very much in Clint Eastwood's work the economy that Don Siegel offers up, which is to say, motions aren't wasted, scenes aren't wasted, there isn't a shot in the film that doesn't carry its own weight, there isn't a scene that doesn't simultaneously pay off something and set off something else and contribute to the advancement of the plot and increase your knowledge of the character. You do all of them together, you do it quietly, and when you're done, you're gone. And then there's the audience having seen a satisfying movie.
I think my father was getting clear about, or had a kind of design, or played with, or enjoyed the mythology of Don Siegel at this point. Certainly, putting himself in the film, which was that Hitchcockian device, right? So now he puts himself in the films, because a Siegel film is equally as important as a Hitchcock film. The fact that he now got that title credit, a Siegel film, I think he was the first director to get that. All these things were part of his own kind of branding of himself.
It's an interesting credit because I don't know of any other American film that has that kind of possessory credit. I'm the vice president of the Writers Guild of America West, and as someone who represents screenwriters, we don't love the possessory credit. We say, what does a Siegel film tell you that produced and directed by Don Siegel doesn't already tell you? So often there's a directing credit, and then there's a kind of possessory credit or un film de hovering over the main body of the credits like some malevolent zeppelin, and we don't know why. That having been said, I'm comfortable enough as a writer and comfortable enough as my father's son to say that Charley Varrick is, in fact, a Siegel film.
I think his pleasure that after all the years of hardship that he had gone through as a director, and he went through a lot of hardship as a director, that he now was finally getting credit as he deserved. And he was kind of creating this mythology about Don Siegel. So clearly Last of the Independents also is part of his oeuvre, his mythology about himself.
The sad thing about Charley Varrick is that it died at the box office, and it died at the box office because Universal let it die.
Universal did nothing with this movie when it was released. They just pushed it out of the rug. Why? I will never know.
It's like they wanted, I don't know, a tax break or something. But it's, after it opened, when I saw it, I think it was, we were living in New York, and when I saw it, I mean, it was so different from Dirty Harry, but it was like, it was its own thing. It was truly an original film. And then nothing. They just stopped advertising it, and then it left theaters after a few weeks.
But it was such a different role for Walter. And it made me so angry because of him that they didn't do more with it, because it was such a totally different role for him. I mean, he was a leading man. It showed a whole other part of him. It should have been paid more attention to.
And the only place, you know, it was Europe. Europe is the place. I think it won the English Academy Award, BAFTA, you know, but certainly the English and the French. I mean, we're totally, you know, appreciative of the film.
I was so close to Don, and we became so much friends. You know, as a matter of fact, he did one of his last birthdays. He had his birthday. He celebrated that, invited me to one of the best restaurants here in Los Angeles. And he made a table. We all had to go with tuxedos, and I didn't understand why. But we went, and it was everybody who had worked with him, not only actors, because Clint Eastwood was there, and Walter Matthau. As a matter of fact, Walter sat next to me in the table. Not only actors and actresses, but also film editors, all the main people that work with him, sound people, you know, and it was a great moment. Maybe a great moment, but maybe very sad in retrospect, because he passed away. Then I kept, he left a legacy. And the legacy was for me to keep working with his disciple, let's call it, Clint Eastwood. So, you know, there was a legacy that came from Don Siegel, and we kept going. Clint kept directing films. I did some of them, and Charley Varrick is part of that legacy.
I put together a presentation for this celebration of my father's work at the Directors Guild of America that was pretty incredible, you know, in which I had access to all of his films. And I think he did 36 films. I must have used about 15 movie clips. And one of them was from Charley Varrick. And of course, I asked Walter Matthau to come and speak at the memorial, and he was very funny, because he said, I had no idea this was such a good picture. I showed that great last sequence with the plane and the car, which is such a gas to watch. You know, he acknowledged that it was really a remarkable picture. And of course, the whole afternoon was amazing, because I showed an incredible sequence from The Killers, and Angie Dickinson was there. We showed, obviously, you know, one of the sequences from Dirty Harry, and Clint came and spoke. So, you know, it was one remarkable film star or contributor to these films after another, and all these marvelous films, and all their best sequences, like Angie being hung out the window in The Killers. And that's what you see in these movies, is a kind of odd point of view, a very private way of viewing the world that he brought to his films, and they suddenly have a kind of vitality and personal life that is remarkable. And it's just, you know, it's why these films survive and why we still watch them. And this movie was made, what, 40 years ago? And it's still a really, really good film.